Thank you for still being here this afternoon. So just like everyone else, I'm going to give the preface that learning health systems is not where I am steeped, that I might be an outlier for the rest of the speakers, and that a lot of what I'm going to talk about takes place in Brazil. So I want you to travel with me. Also, as was mentioned in my introduction, I take an interdisciplinary view at health policy. So that means that history will be involved, anthropology will be involved, some sociology will be involved in how we think about inclusion and exclusion, which is the title of my talk, Bounded Justice and Tensions Between Inclusion and Exclusion and the Implications for Learning Health Systems. So I'm hoping that by the end of this that you'll be able to get something from where I situate myself, which is around areas of race and ancestry and citizenship, and what that means for knowledge production for particular groups, particularly marginalized groups. So I come to you today, as many of you, wearing several hats. I'm a newish professor in the School of Public Health with expertise in health policy, social movements, and knowledge production, using sickle cell disease in Brazil as the lens to tell these stories. I was also, before this, served as a health scientist in the Division of Blood Disorders at the CDC for almost a decade, serving those living with hemophilia, thalassemia, and sickle cell disease via partnerships with national organizations, educational institutions, and healthcare systems. And before all of this, I was born with sickle cell disease. And so in studying sickle cell disease from the government's perspective, a researcher's perspective, and my very own personal lived experience perspective, I have seen the tensions between power, legitimacy, and efficacy. Sickle cell disease is an important political site in which race, citizenship, biological determinism, ancestry, and health are contested. Within sickle cell disease, we can also interrogate how both science and race are constructed and how hard it is to disentangle the two. Currently, I study how social health movements in Brazil for sickle cell disease have led to policy change on the local level. This was done through policy processes that were embedded in the Brazilian Constitution. Physicians worked to ensure that every citizen was guaranteed health as a right. Further, the state mandated that individuals from disease-based organizations like sickle cell disease had to sit at the proverbial table for the development, maintenance, and evaluation of health policy. Epistemic authority for knowledge production around sickle cell disease in Brazil lay mostly at the feet of elite scientists associated with established institutions. These gatekeepers often focus on the biological and medical processes that take place within the body. In opposition to this line of thinking are those who work within the state-sponsored public health infrastructure with strong ties to the sickle cell disease movement, who have successfully shifted the focus from inside the body to outside. Further, many in the social movement deem any interest from scientists in this population to be based in a paradigm that creates the person living with sickle cell disease as a commodity to clinical science with a lack of legitimate knowledge to contribute to the scientific discourse. The static and biological definition of sickle cell disease is reconfigured by the state and its Afro-Brazilian citizens. This co-production of health policy is based on both biological and cultural distinction. These distinctions were attached by citizen and state alike to Blackness, despite a patient pool that spans the phenotypic spectrum, particularly in Brazil. This reconfiguration occurred in part by the 1988 reformed federal constitution, here's some history, which built in language that mandated that sickle cell disease communities had to be part of the development, maintenance, and evaluation of health policy in conjunction with the Ministry of Health. Despite this constitutional mandate for inclusion in policy, the societal and cultural influences to genomic discourse provided by sickle cell disease activists are discredited by scientists. There is a failure to recognize the impact of culture and history on science in the same way that the state and others do so for policy. Even though these citizens were at the table, they still weren't really being heard. This tension between the processes of inclusion and the structural limitations of being seen is what I call bounded justice. As I define it, it is an attempt to distribute health rights without disturbing the underlying mechanisms that generated the initial inequalities in the first place. Its performance hinges on the historico-geographical context in which it is situated and can permeate any number of medical, social, and ethical realms. So how might bounded justice be applicable for us today as we think about consent, especially with marginalized populations? In the Brazilian case, bounded justice is linked to a larger concept I call biocultural citizenship, a deep entanglement of biology and culture as shown through Brazilian actors who attempt to gain access to fuller citizenship. For the sake of time, we won't go into detail about this conceptual model, except to understand that there are three layers here, biological, cultural, and societal. Bounded justice operates in the social realm. Any justice that occurs, like allowing for the marginal to have a seat at the table to begin with, is bounded in nature due to the undeniably inequitable society in which it occurs. In Brazil, there are two sides involved in the production of bounded justice. On one side is the state, which is not interested in redistributing power beyond that required by a legislative mandate to address inequality. On the other are political activists with sickle cell disease who have been given a seat at this proverbial table with no real political capital. The limited experience of Afro-Brazilians in wielding political power is a result of very active racism and the legacy of the collective and cultural trauma of slavery. This anemic attempt at justice by the state is also limited by the social reality that production of limited knowledge about the science and medicine of sickle cell disease is still dominated by individuals and institutions with no ties to the Black health movement. So herein lies the conflict between science and the social movement public, if you will. Different sectors of society, science, private sector, public agencies, and civil society, they organize knowledge and action according to individual timescales, categories, priorities, etc. Members of each culture may look at the same situation and come to opposite conclusions of what is and what has to be done. Based on their cultural norms, knowledges, practices, and discourses, they focus on the various elements of the situation and interrelate and interpret them differently. The concept of biocultural citizenship, as mentioned earlier, helps frame the thought processes of those in the sickle cell disease movement and state health apparatus. It recognizes that in Brazil, sickle cell disease is both a biological phenomenon and an urgent cultural issue that is legitimized by its African origins. This cultural reconfiguration of sickle cell disease, as shaped by these interlocutors, often Black and further delegitimized by their lack of medical and research experience, mandate that specific definitions of sickle cell disease take this frame as well. This is in Portuguese, I will explain. Those in the public health apparatus and sickle cell disease movement resist the normative ways that scientific or epidemiologic knowledge is produced. Consider this text from a slide set from the Bahia Association for People with Sickle Cell Disease titled Incidence Data for Sickle Cell Disease in Brazil. This was the third introductory slide to explain the disease's origins. And it reads, sickle cell disease was not brought from Africa by enslaved Blacks. It is a consequence of criminal uprooting. Ignorance and disregard for this disease result from the process of colonization, segregation, and racism in Brazil and the Americas. Those inserted in the sickle cell disease movement are keenly aware of the ways in which biology, culture, and society are intertwined. Though this presentation, not mine, is about data, they demonstrate a biocultural positioning by usurping how epidemiology is framed. So sociologist Janet Shim tells us that the construction of epidemiologic knowledge and its application in clinical practice can be seen as an example of a power-knowledge relation. Lost it. The production and centralization of knowledge in order to maximize control over individual and social bodies. Those in the movement, and even those tangential to it, participate in the social infrastructure of biomedical knowledge production in ways that are contrary to those seen in the scientists. In an ethics framework for our learning healthcare system, Ruth Faden, and I've been hearing this name throughout the day, Ruth Faden and colleagues propose a departure from traditional research ethics and clinical ethics. She and her colleagues argue for a specific novel obligation on health professionals and healthcare institutions to be active contributors to learning in healthcare. And she argues that a similar obligation extends to patients, 5 minutes, got it, who have traditionally not been conceived in research ethics as having duty to contribute to the ongoing learning that is integrated with the healthcare they receive. So how do we navigate the tensions between what is deemed historically legitimate by the standards of science in terms of learning in healthcare? We need to know that the ways of knowing can't always be standardized. If we want to honor all of the voices involved in the learning process, and we ourselves want to learn how to better bridge notions of inclusion, we must be prepared to question what is valued on a systemic and structural level. This means that we push against the norms of how data is collected and how data is reported. We understand that in valuing all voices, we must reach beyond a purely biomedical construct in the ask. In recognition that the sickle cell communities that I work with, their own activist efforts are steeped in the assertion of their personal and political identities, it was incumbent upon me as a researcher to embrace a methodology that would be attentive to the nuance of individual personhood and collective narrative. By utilizing oral history as part of my data collection, I am centering the voices of the community and allowing for a representativeness that might not be foregrounded in typical public health work. I use these voices to tell a wider story about policy development and embodiment. I am intentional about marginalized voices being added to the archive as contribution to the scholarly conversations about race, ancestry, and policy. It is unwise to assume that only geneticists can contribute to these conversations. The advocates I met were indeed quite savvy about their genetic profile and its utility. I work to be intentional that there is reach beyond the ivory tower. Yes, the currency of academia is in peer-reviewed publications. I know this. Lord knows I know this. But it is of equal or greater value that you create products that can be of use to the very communities that have given themselves to you. So for me, this means the creation of products available for those in the sickle cell disease movement in Brazil, audio, video, and image archives, accessible text in Portuguese. There must always be an intention of reciprocity and hope that these products further empower a community to utilize the science they contribute to and enhance the healthcare that they receive. This kind of methodology, I understand, is not one that is easily applied to many research initiatives, but I bring it up to make a point about intentionality. I know that great work is being done in conceptualizing the return of value to participants of a learning system once they've consented. But how do we begin to normalize the valuing of the patient themselves? How do we normalize the presence of underserved populations at NIH meetings or meetings like this? How do we normalize discussions about social, political, and historical forces at every step of the learning activity, but particularly around ideas of consent? How do we dig deep and call out our own and other biases at every step? I will end here by saying that if we are truly invested in co-creating a learning health system, it's going to mandate a close examination of the viewpoint of consent as inclusionary, given the exclusionary practices that are put in place by society. This will be a slow and messy process, even slower and messier given that some elements of the system may now be deemed as hostile. In the United States, the marginalized have historically been conscripted for experimental medical research while denied access to quality health care. As an informant in a study by Ruha Benjamin said, "Why am I in such demand as a research subject when no one wants me as a patient?" We must continue to be creative in our inclusivity, and we must be well aware of what it may cost us and do it anyway. That is it. I look forward to a rich discussion that is going to be led by Ray and Doreen, and also some booze. And I hope that this was provoking of some questions that will help end the session on a productive note. Thank you.